At my son's graduation party, my daughter-in-law cornered me in the kitchen and told me to sign my house over to them. When I said no, she grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark. So I walked out to the backyard, pulled out my phone, and made 2 calls. 40 minutes later, 2 cars pulled into the driveway. My daughter-in-law's face went white the moment she saw who stepped out. The front door didn't slam that evening. It opened slowly, almost carefully, the way my son always moved when he was carrying something fragile. I heard his footsteps on the porch before the latch clicked, that familiar, uneven rhythm from the knee he'd heard playing baseball in high school and never quite let heal properly. "Dad," he called out from the entryway. "You still up?" I was sitting at the kitchen table with the crossword folded open in front of me, though I'd stopped actually seeing the clues about 20 minutes earlier. "In here," I said. He came around the corner and I could tell immediately from the way he was holding himself. Shoulders up, chin forward, that particular brightness in his eyes that reminded me so much of his mother when she'd made a decision she knew wasn't going to land well, that something had happened. "Big news," he said. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down without taking off his jacket. "Really big news." I set the pen down. "Okay, Diane and I are moving up the wedding." I waited, like a lot. He reached across the table and adjusted the salt shaker, which didn't need adjusting. "We're thinking 6 weeks. 6 weeks. My son had been with this woman for 4 months. I'd met her exactly 3 times, and each of those times I'd walked away feeling like I'd been appraised and found slightly disappointing. She had a way of looking at a room that wasn't quite looking at the room, more like cataloging it. "That's fast," I said. "When it's right, it's right." He finally looked at me directly. "I knew with her, Dad, same way you knew with Mom." That part wasn't fair, and he knew it, which is probably why he said it. I picked the pen back up and set it down again. "I want to be happy for you," I said, "but..." "No but." I kept my voice level. "I am happy for you. I just think 6 weeks is very fast for a decision this permanent." His jaw shifted. "You've never liked her." "I don't know her well enough to like or dislike her. That's part of what concerns me. She's warm and she's smart and she makes me feel like myself." He was leaning forward now. "What more do you need to know?" What I needed to tell him, what I couldn't quite figure out how to say without detonating the whole conversation, was that I'd watched Diane at his birthday dinner 2 months ago. Not the Diane he saw, laughing at his stories and touching his arm every few minutes, but the other one. The Diane who, while he was in the bathroom, asked me with genuine curiosity how much the house had appreciated since I'd bought it. The one who, when I mentioned I was thinking about traveling more now that I was retired, had said, "Oh, that's such a good use of your savings," with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'd been married to one woman for 31 years. I knew what genuine interest looked like. I also knew what something else looked like. But my son was sitting across from me with that light in his eyes, and the words wouldn't come in the right order. "Let's have dinner," I said instead. "The 3 of us, before anything gets planned." He exhaled. "Yeah." "Okay, yeah, we can do that." He left 20 minutes later, and I sat at the table long after his taillights disappeared down the street. The crossword stayed open in front of me, unsolved. I thought about my wife Carol, gone 6 years now. She'd had this gift for reading people quickly and accurately that I'd always admired and sometimes envied. She could sit across from someone at a dinner table and know within 20 minutes whether they were genuine. I'd watched her do it dozens of times. I never quite figured out how. I pulled her photo from the side table, the one from our anniversary trip to Maine, her laughing at something just off camera, the wind pulling her hair sideways. I held it for a while without saying anything, because after 6 years, I still hadn't figured out what to say. Then I went upstairs and lay in the dark, and thought about how to protect my son from something I couldn't quite prove. Dinner was a Thursday. My son arrived first, came straight to the kitchen the way he always did, lifted the lid on whatever was on the stove, and nodded approvingly. "Pot roast," he said. "She's gonna love this." Diane arrived 7 minutes later, alone, having driven separately without explanation. She came through the door with a bouquet of grocery store flowers held out in front of her like a small shield. "These are for you," she said, smiling. "I wanted to bring something." "That's very thoughtful," I said, and I meant it, or tried to. We moved to the living room while the roast finished. She sat on the end of the couch closest to the window and looked around the room slowly. That cataloging look again, softer this time, more concealed. Her eyes stopped briefly on Carol's writing desk in the corner. "Walnut, antique, 40 years in this house." "What a beautiful piece," she said. "Is that original to the house?" "It was my wife's." She nodded slowly. "It must be worth something now. That style is very sought after." My son smiled like this was a charming observation. I smiled like it was too. We sat down to eat. Diane picked at the pot roast and mentioned that she didn't usually eat red meat, but was happy to try it. She found the carrots slightly underdone. She asked about the wine, seemed briefly interested when I mentioned the vineyard, then set her glass down and didn't touch it again. She was not overtly rude. That would have been easier. She was just slightly, continuously off, like a radio signal that's almost tuned in. Every few minutes there'd be something that landed sideways, and you'd wonder if you'd imagined it. She mentioned, somewhere between the main course and dessert, that my neighborhood had held its values surprisingly well for an older area. She mentioned that she'd always imagined herself living somewhere with a real yard, not just a city lot. She mentioned, looking at a photo on the sideboard, that it must be hard being surrounded by so many memories. "Sometimes it's healthy to clear things out," she said. "Start fresh." My son shifted in his chair. "Diane, what?" "I'm just saying, a lot of people find it freeing." "Carol's only been gone 6 years." "I know, sweetheart. I'm not trying to be insensitive." She looked at me then with an expression of careful sympathy that I recognized, not because I'd seen it on her face before, but because I'd seen it before, a long time ago, on someone else entirely. My first wife. My ex-wife, Sandra, 28 years old, sitting across from my father at Sunday dinner, giving him that same look of practiced warmth while her eyes stayed completely still. We were married for 2 years. She left when she realized my starting salary as an electrician was not going to become something else quickly enough. Some lessons you only need once. But apparently, once hadn't been enough for me to pass them on to my son. They left at 8:30. I walked them to the door, stood on the porch while they went down the steps. My son hugged me before he got in his car. Diane gave me a light pat on the arm and said dinner was really nice. I went back inside and started clearing the table. That's when I found it. Her phone was wedged between the seat cushion and the side of the dining room chair. Must have slipped out of her jacket pocket while she sat down. The screen was dark. I picked it up to set it on the counter, and as I did, a notification lit the screen. I didn't mean to read it. The words were just there before I could look away. "Missing you. Tonight felt so long. Coming by tomorrow?" The contact name was R. Beneath it, a second notification appeared before the screen went dark again. "Can't stop thinking about our trip. Say yes." I stood there, holding the phone for a moment. Then I set it on the counter and stood looking at it the way you look at something that just changed the shape of a room. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the kitchen wall. Her car in the driveway. I moved the phone to the entryway table before she knocked. "I think I left my phone," she said when I opened the door. Her voice was perfectly casual. Her eyes were not. "Right here," I said. "Just found it." She took it quickly, glanced at the screen in a way she probably thought I didn't notice. Whatever she saw either did or didn't worry her. She smiled and said goodnight. I stood at the window and watched her back out of the driveway. Then I sat in Carol's armchair and thought about what I'd seen. One message from one contact meant nothing by itself. My son was 29 years old, and I loved him, and I wasn't going to blow apart his life over a glimpse at a stranger's phone screen. I needed to be sure. More than sure. I needed to be the kind of certain you can put in front of someone and have them not be able to look away from it. I opened my notepad to a blank page and wrote R at the top. Then I started planning. I knew 3 things about Diane. She worked Thursday through Sunday evenings at a wine bar downtown called the Meridian. She had a gym bag in the back of her car that she seemed to take everywhere, and she mentioned once, almost in passing, that she hated eating alone. That last detail had seemed unremarkable when she said it. Now it seemed relevant. I started that Friday evening. I parked half a block from the Meridian at 9:45 in front of a dry cleaner with a deep enough awning that I could sit without being obvious. I'd brought a thermos of coffee and a paperback I wasn't going to read. An hour later, Diane came out the employee entrance on the side street, gym bag over one shoulder. She'd been at work for 6 hours. She wasn't heading home. A black Jeep was idling at the curb. The driver, a man, maybe 40, broad-shouldered work jacket, got out when he saw her. They embraced. Not the quick hug of friends. The other kind. They drove north. I wrote down the time, the make of the car, a partial plate. Saturday, I was back. Different car. Different parking spot. Same result, different man. This one in a silver pickup. They walked to a restaurant 2 blocks away and sat by the window. I watched from a coffee shop across the street with a view of the booth. They stayed 90 minutes. The man with the silver pickup had his hand on her hand for most of it. I drove home thinking about what I was doing, whether I was becoming something I didn't want to be. Obsessive. Paranoid. A vindictive old man who couldn't accept that his son had chosen someone he didn't like. Then I thought about Sandra, sitting across from my father with that still-eyed warmth, and my son's savings being spent on a ring, and the words, starting fresh, and held its value surprisingly well. And I kept going. 3 weeks. I was methodical about it the way I'd been methodical about everything for 40 years of electrical work. Log it, date it, verify it, don't assume. I gave each man a letter when I didn't yet have a name. The Jeep driver was R, I was fairly sure, based on a piece of conversation I caught near an open window one evening. The pickup man, I learned, was named Ted, because she said his name when she laughed, and she said it more than once. By the end of the 3rd week, I had 19 photographs. The dates and times of 14 separate meetings between Diane and at least 2 other men during the 4 weeks she'd been planning her wedding to my son. Ted's last name from a bumper sticker for his construction company, R's first name confirmed. Their approximate schedules, the name of the restaurant they frequented. I also had something I hadn't expected, documentation that both men believed they were in an exclusive relationship with her. I knew because I'd seen Ted buy her flowers from the vendor outside the restaurant, the real kind, arranged, not grocery store. And because R had given her something in a small box one Friday evening, something she'd opened and smiled at for a long time before putting in her pocket. Neither man knew about my son. I was fairly certain neither man knew about the other. The wedding was on a Saturday in early May, at a venue outside the city. White tent, garden ceremony, about 60 guests. My son had been planning it for weeks, talking about it with a kind of careful happiness that I recognized. The way you handle something you're afraid of losing. I kept my mouth shut until 4 days before. Then I drove to his apartment on a Tuesday afternoon and told him I needed to talk to him about something important. He let me in. Made coffee. Sat across from me at his kitchen table with an expression that was already partly closed, the way it got when he was bracing. I need you to hear me out before you respond, I said. Dad, please. He was quiet. I put the folder on the table. Not all of it at once. I'd organized it carefully. The timeline first. 3 weeks, 14 dates. 2 men, documented. Then the photographs, in chronological order. Then the names. He didn't say anything for a long time. He turned each photograph over slowly, looking at each one. His coffee went cold. At some point, he pressed his thumb and forefinger against his eyes and sat like that for a moment. How long have you been doing this? He finally asked. 3 weeks. And you didn't tell me. I needed to be certain. I didn't want to bring you something I wasn't certain of. He put the photographs down. This could be anything. It could be, I said. But it isn't. He sat there. I didn't push. I need to think, he said. Take whatever time you need. I'll be home. I drove back and waited. He called me that evening and said he'd spoken to her, that she denied everything, that the men in the photographs were old friends from before she met him. He said it in a tone that suggested he'd already decided not to believe it, but didn't know yet what to do with that. Do you want to know who Ted is? I asked. A pause. What do you mean? His last name. His company. You can call him yourself if you want to. You don't have to take my word for any of this. Silence on the line. I'll send you his information, I said. I did. He didn't call me back that night. The wedding was in 4 days. I didn't know what was going to happen. I went to sleep that night not knowing whether my son would stand at that altar or not, whether he would speak to me afterward, whether I'd irreparably broken something I couldn't fix. What I did know was that I had told him the truth as clearly and completely as I could. The rest was his. He showed up at the venue on Saturday. I don't know what I expected. I got there early. The venue was a garden space, white tent, rows of chairs on a stone patio, everything arranged beautifully. I sat in the front row on the groom's side and watched people arrive and thought about Carol, who would have known what to do with all of this, who would have found a way through it that I hadn't. The ceremony began at 2. My son stood at the altar with a composed, unreadable expression that reminded me of how he'd looked at his mother's funeral, present but slightly behind glass, holding himself very carefully. Diane was beautiful. Whatever else was true about her, she walked down that aisle with perfect composure. Flowers in both hands, a dress that cost more than my first car. She took my son's hands and looked at him, and for a moment I wondered if I'd gotten it all wrong. Then the officine began, and Diane exhaled and her eyes drifted briefly, just briefly, over the assembled guests, and I saw it again. That cataloging look. There and gone. The reception was in the same tent, tables rearranged, a band at the far end. I stood near the edge of things and watched my son make the rounds, accepting congratulations, occasionally catching my eye with an expression I couldn't read. Around 5 o'clock, Diane found me. She waited until there was a gap in the nearest conversation, steered me a few steps toward the edge of the tent where the noise dropped enough to talk. I owe you something, she said. I waited. An apology. She met my eyes steadily. I know what you did. The surveillance, the folder. A slight pause. Ted told me someone had called him. That surprised me. I kept it off my face. I didn't handle this well, she said. Any of it. I know that. She glanced toward the tent where my son was talking with his aunt. I love him, for what it's worth. That part is real. Then everything else should have been different, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded slightly, the way someone does when they've run out of angles. I went back to find my son. I didn't get far. He found me first, at the edge of the garden where the tent met the grass, the evening starting to cool. He walked over without hurrying, and we stood next to each other for a moment, watching the light change on the lawn. She told me she called it off, he said. Ted and the other one, before the wedding. When? Wednesday. He didn't look at me. After I called Ted. So he had called. I hadn't known that. She said she'd been scared, he said. That she keeps exits. He was quiet for a moment. She cried. She hasn't cried in front of me before, not like that. I thought about what to say and chose not to say most of it. How do you feel? I asked. I don't know yet. He finally looked at me. I know you tried to stop this. I know you were trying to protect me. I was. I'm not sure you were wrong to protect me. I was. I'm not sure you were wrong to. I let that sit. What happens now is going to be between the two of you, I said. That's where it belongs. He nodded slowly. I'm going to need time to work through this. We both are. That's reasonable. He looked out at the lawn again. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right. Did you go through all of that, the weeks of it, because you genuinely believed I was in danger? Or because you didn't like her from the beginning and you were looking for a reason? It was a fair question. I'd asked myself the same one, alone in my car outside a bar at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night, wondering what Carol would say if she could see me. Both were true at the start, I said. By the end, only one was. He looked at me a long moment. Then he breathed out through his nose and some of the tension left his shoulders. Okay, he said. We stood there for a while without talking, the band starting up something slow inside the tent. People laughed. Glasses clinked. You should know, I said finally, that if she proves me wrong about who she is, I will be genuinely glad. He almost smiled. I'll tell her you said that. You don't have to. I know. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder. But I'm going to. He went back inside. I stayed at the edge of the garden a little longer, in the cooling evening air, watching the light in the tent where my son was dancing with his wife. I didn't know how it would turn out. Marriage is long, and people are complicated, and sometimes the thing you are afraid of doesn't come for you the way you expected. It comes a different way, or it doesn't come at all. I'd been wrong before. I hoped to be wrong again, but I'd done what I could do, with everything I had, and the time I was given. That has to be enough when you're a father. It has to be. I drove home in the dark, the city lights thinning out as I got farther from the venue, and I thought about calling my son in the morning just to check in, the way I'd always done. Back when he was in college, when he moved into his first apartment, all the different versions of keeping in touch with someone you love who was living his own life. Some things don't change much. When I got home, I sat in Carol's armchair for a while with the lights off. I didn't take out her photo. I just sat in the quiet and thought that she would have found a better way through all of this, and that maybe she would have been proud of me anyway, and that the two things weren't contradictory. That's the thing about doing your best. It doesn't mean you got it right. It just means you tried.